My name is Anahi Dugurlayan, and I am co-chair of the Armenian Bar Association's Domestic Violence Committee. The Domestic Violence Committee was formed in 2020 to address the scourge of domestic violence in Armenia and also raise awareness about domestic violence in the diaspora. We're very pleased to host a series of programs on women's rights and activism with the American University of Armenia's. And we had, the theme is the past, present, and future. The first program, which focused on the past, featured Professor Hazmi Khalapian, and we're very pleased to have Professor Siranush Sahakyan talk about the present. She's also going to be moderating a live Zoom program. The date is to be determined, but it will be in October to coincide with Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we will have a focus on the global activism with respect to domestic violence as well as local activism. So I want to just give a brief introduction about Professor Sahakyan. She is the program chair and assistant lecturer, assistant professor at the AUA. She holds an LLM in International Human Rights Law from the University of Essex, a bachelor's degree in law and LLM in public international law from the Yerevan State University. Her pending PhD is dedicated to the margin of appreciation doctrine. She is a highly accomplished and versatile professional with over 15 years of experience in human rights, judicial reforms, and corruption prevention. Ms. Sahakyan served as an aide to the President of Armenia and was in a service at the Ministry of Justice of Armenia and chaired the corruption prevention body in Armenia as an ad hoc judge of the European Court of Human Rights. Outside of public service, Professor Sahakyan partnered at Legalata law firm and was a founder and professor of the NGO Protection of Rights Without Borders, an expert for the OSCE, ODIHR, UNICEF Armenia, UNDP, the Civil Society Institute NGO, Social Justice NGO, the Center for European Law and Integration, the International Center for Transitional Justice, and being involved in different legislative initiatives, lobbying projects, monitoring research, strategic litigation, and legal counsel. Currently, she is the co-founder of the NGO Path of Law and the president of the IC Law Center Armenia. She's worked closely with the Justice Academy and School of Advocates, implementing judicial training programs for judges, prosecutors, and their candidates. Her collaboration included development of course curricula on topics of constitutional law, human rights, integrity, conflict of law, public administration, principles, etc. She's a licensed attorney and has professional membership with the Chamber Advocates of Armenia, and she has successfully managed practices in complex human rights issues. We are so honored to have you, Professor Sahakyan, so I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great initiative, and I feel honored to be part of this initiative and share information, word on women's rights in Armenia within this great initiative. I'm planning to focus on current situation of women's rights in Armenia, also focusing on domestic violence, which is a critical issue in Armenia. And despite legislative amendments, reforms, still we face many challenges at the application level of law. I think for us to be very efficient in protection of women's rights in Armenia, we have to understand the legislative framework both international commitments and domestic legislation. Second, the institutions which have a serious role and responsibility in applying legislation. Third, social norms and culture. So I'll try to introduce what infrastructure so far has been created in Armenia, which can create enabling, conducive environment for women's rights. I'll start from international commitments, which are quite strong. So Armenia acceded to main international human rights instruments dedicated to the protection of women's rights, especially the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And positively, it ratified also optional protocol, including inquiry procedure, which is in force from 2006. Armenia, since 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women, continues to be politically very active in engaging around national, regional, and the global dialogue on the Beijing Platform for Action. And recently, the government prepared its national review of Beijing. Armenia also closely works with European institutions, particularly with EU, and in 2017, the EU-Armenian Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement was signed, which has a specific commitment to equal opportunities, anti-discrimination, aimed at enhancing gender equality and ensuring equal opportunities between women and men, as well as combating discrimination based on sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion, belief, age, or sexual orientation. And this agreement remains a key document in cooperation between Armenia and the European Union, which is a great partner for Armenia. I would say very important development happened in 2018 January, when Armenia signed the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. But Armenia placed reservations concerning several articles, and what remains an open issue, that no ratification happened so far. And within society, there are different groups which support or are against the ratification, and the aim, the purpose of convention is sometimes being manipulated and used for different reasons. Also trying to change the purpose of this convention. Also in 2006, Armenia issued a standing invitation to the special procedure mandate holders of the Human Rights Council, which means that UN special rapporteurs can have formal visits to Armenia, and those dealing with women's rights have the possibility to visit and organize on-site research, study, investigation, and report internationally on the situation. So I would say these international commitments are very strong, and they create good grounds for protection of women's rights in Armenia. Concerning local domestic legislative framework, again, it is relatively strong compared to other countries, and Women's Global SDG database gives Armenia quite high scoring, 81.8 for overall legislative frameworks on gender equality and women's empowerment. 41% for overall legislative framework on gender-based violence, and 80% for overall legislative frameworks on employment and economic empowerment, and 81 for overall legislative frameworks on marriage and family. So with this data, we can conclude that legislatively conditions are created for a better protection of women's rights. However, if we try to assess the situation on ground, then we'll meet many challenges, and I'm going to discuss about them later. The government in recent years was very active in developing policy framework, and critical documents were adopted, particularly national action plans for the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325/2000 on women and peace and security. This is a timely policy considering the conflict in Artsakh and its impact on women's rights. There is another national action plan on combating trafficking in persons, and this plan was for the period 2020-2022. There is a strategy for gender policy implementation for the period 2019-2023. And action plan relating to the national strategy for human rights protection for the period of 2020 to 2022. And those policy documents are aimed at accelerating the elimination of discrimination against women and promoting gender equality. Unfortunately, in Armenia, we don't have a standalone law on non-discrimination, and in the fight against discrimination, we mostly rely on constitution, which prohibits discrimination of any kind. Very good possibilities are given through European Convention on Fundamental Human Rights and Freedoms and its protocols. There is Article 14, which prohibits discrimination in enjoying rights which are enshrined on the Convention. And a separate Protocol 12, which prohibits discrimination for enjoying rights which are protected not only on the international human rights instruments, but also domestic law. And those documents serve as solid ground to litigate also strategically before international bodies on discrimination. And here we have a judicial body which is considering violations of conventional rights. An important step was taken in 2013 with adoption of the law on guaranteeing equal rights and opportunities for women and men. Armenia's reproductive health law is relatively strong in support of women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. The only challenge remains in ensuring rural women from ethnic minorities and women living with disabilities affordable access and quality services and rights upheld in this law. Some amendments were made in this law in 2016 in order to tackle sex-selective abortion, but human rights activists raised concerns that those amendments might be misused by conservative-minded health practitioners to screen the reasons behind women's requests for abortions. But at least at legislative level, we do have progression. Special measures are taken in the electoral codes, which contributes to tackling gender-based discrimination in political life. And this issue was recently addressed by the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The last concluding observations were adopted at the end of 2022, and the committee noted with appreciation Armenia's commitment to advancing the political participation of women, which is a priority area, and it is reflected in gender policy implementation strategy for the period 2019-2023. And there was evidence that female representation was increased in the National Assembly to 35.5% in 2021. However, still the committee remained concerned that women are still underrepresented in decision-making positions in the government, academia, judiciary, public service, and foreign service. Available statistical data shows that within civil service, high civil service posts are mostly occupied by men as compared to women. This was increased to 19% of managerial positions being occupied by women. But overall, the problem is there, and specific special measures should be taken in order to create factual equality here. Some studies were conducted at the local level, and here women's leadership role continues to be limited. We have information as of the date of 2019, and the data shows that only one female mayor was among 46 urban communities in Armenia. And only one of the 52 heads of the consolidated municipalities was a woman. There are currently no women governors, and the number of deputy governors, women, are also limited. The women's rights in the family and marriage were also assessed internationally. Within civil code, women are granted equal property rights, but in practice, women rarely exercise these rights. And data supports that this inequality exists in respect of inheritance and land ownership. And those practices historically were in place, and they still continue to exist. Armenian constitution also enshrines the right to free choice and consent in marriage. For a long period of time, no criminal liability was applicable for forced marriages or divorce. But with the adoption of new criminal code, which happened in 2021, criminal liability is introduced for forced marriage, divorce, or pregnancy. One unresolved issue remains the marriage age. though the same legal age of marriage for women and men are prescribed by law, 18 years of age. However, some exceptions exist when women can get a permission from their parents or legal guardians to marry at the age of 17. And international human rights bodies, they recommend Armenia to modify legislation to exclude any exceptions and have the same minimum legal age of marriage, 18, for both women and men. The other important sphere is employment. And when we are looking at prime working age, women's labor force participation rates remain a challenge. So the data from 2019 shows that it is 62.4 as compared to men, which is 86.1. And when we are looking at marital status, then with 67.8 of married men compared to 46.3 of married women being employed. The industry is the main sector of employment, with women's engagement at 55% and the men's engagement at 46%. In general, after the agricultural sector, women tend to be more engaged in education, wholesale and retail trade, and human health and social work. Interesting trend is that women engagement in the IT sector is growing, placing Armenia among some of the top countries in the world for women's engagement in the IT sector. According to the official data, differences in nominal wages between men and women decreased by, there was a decrease. Nonetheless, this gender pay gap stands 32.5, and here there is challenges to women's economic security, which in large part could be due to the gender norms, which may result in girls being streamed into traditional education and subsequent labor sectors, which may often be non-competitive or undervalued sectors. The assumption by society, including employers and decision makers in government, that women's primary job is to take care of the family, which impacts young women's employment opportunities. At this period of time, we have a problem with internally displaced women and women in refugee-like situation. So at legislative level, there was improvement because national action plans were adopted for the implementation of this Security Council resolution on women and peace and security. However, the status of women and girls remains challenging. They have limited access to education, employment, healthcare, housing, and are inadequately protected from gender-based violence. It is also concerned that women have been marginalized and are not actively and meaningfully participating in all stages of peace and reconstruction processes, and women's priorities and experiences of their armed conflict have not been fully integrated into those processes. Despite legislative developments, reforms, and improvements, one key gap remains, that insufficient budgetary allocations are being made for the implementation. There are no monitoring mechanism in process to assess permanently or regularly the implementation level. There are delays in the enactment of adopted laws, and also limited human capacities exist for implementing the law, and here capacity building actions are needed to empower law enforcement authorities. In the society, there is still persistence of hate speech, discriminatory stereotypes concerning the roles and responsibilities of women and men in the family and in the society. And we can see these attitudes in educational materials and media, which entail women being considered primarily as mothers and caregivers, and we have also discontinued practice of sex-selective abortion. Now I will address a very important issue on domestic violence. In 2014, Armenia adopted the law on identification and assistance to victims of human trafficking and exploitation. And 3 years later, the government adopted the law on prevention of violence within the family, protection of victims of violence within the family, and restoration of peace in the family, which secures preventive and protective mechanisms for the victims of domestic violence, and also for some social assistance guarantees. However, we don't have radical change after the adoption of these laws, and women and girls remain at risk. And because the police or other law enforcement authorities don't comprehensively respond to complaints of domestic violence. And the services to ensure quality services for survivors or accessibility are limited. Domestic violence cases remain largely underreported. According to the 2021 survey on domestic violence against women in Armenia, only 5% of women who experienced physical or sexual violence said they sought help from police, and 53.5% said that help was not expected from anyone. This issue was so important that Human Rights Watch also conducted some fact-finding mission in Armenia, and they spoke with 12 survivors of severe domestic abuse in Armenia. Those interviewed women, they reported that their husband or male partners kicked them, raped them, struck them with furniture and other objects, confined them in home, stalked them, threatened or attempted to kill them with knives or other sharp objects. And 5 women said the attacks against them continued during pregnancy. 3 reported miscarriages after their husbands beat them. And those interviewed people, they informed about their reports to police or other authorities, but authorities did nothing to investigate cases to prevent violence. And in some cases, even authorities took a very active, proactive role and encourage women to drop complaints and reconcile with their abusers. Many failures happened in terms of referring women for services or assistance which was available in Armenia. According to official data, during the first 6 months of 2022, authorities investigated 391 criminal domestic violence complaints. Charges were brought against 128 persons, and in 85 of those, the husband was identified as the alleged perpetrator. 21 cases were initiated on failure to fulfill urgent intervention or protective orders on domestic violence. But the practice also shows that adjudicating judges, they also have bias towards women, and generally there is a limited trust in professionality of judges dealing with those cases. Also limited access to resources to cover the cost of a lawyer. Also limited lawyers, they take responsibility to represent survivors. Many people in the society would regard those as domestic issues and refrain from any type of intervention in the incidents. Apart from this, there is a problem of inadequate shelter, rehabilitation and support services. And many women reported that they lived with abusers for years because they had no means of escape. And Armenia's capacities for domestic violence shelters are very limited, just a few are run. Those are not accessible to women with disabilities. Some standards were developed by the Council of Europe for at least one specialized shelter in every region. And so according to this calculation, one shelter space per 10,000 people standard should be met. With Armenian population, Armenia should have approximately 290 shelter spaces, but definitely the number is not exceeding 10. Also, Armenia lacks a general hotline service for survivors of domestic violence, and the new law mandates creating also government-run shelters, but again, the capacities are very limited. In order to achieve a quick change in application processes, lawyers mostly resort to strategic litigation instrument. And we have an interesting successful case from the European Court of Human Rights, which was recently communicated to Armenian government. The information is publicly available, so I can speak of a concrete victim, Hasmi Khachatryan against Armenia, and this case was sent to the European Court on Human Rights in 2016, but the communication started 5 years later. In this specific case, again, we have abusive husband who, under influence, harassed and threatened the wife. Within a month, 3 serious incidents happened. The husband hit the wife with a chair on different parts of body. She lost consciousness from the shock of pain, but then he continued the blows. Then he burned cigarettes onto the wife's arm. During a fight, also hit the ear, knocked down, severely beat, and so on. And eventually, it was possible for the wife to flee to father's house. She was admitted to a medical center. Some assistance was provided, and her injuries were recorded. And based on a report from medical center, the police opened a criminal case. However, the investigation was not very effective. Even during confrontation, the husband behaved arrogantly, insulting her, threatening to revenge for continuing complaint, and no actions whatsoever were taken by investigators. And also investigation refused to give criminal qualification of this continuous harassment happening during investigation. Though eventually the case was sent to the court, the husband was charged for torture. And her injuries were qualified as minor injuries. Her complaints to secure a measure of restraint in the form of detention were denied during the whole period of investigation. And at the end of proceedings, the court found guilty the husband for torture, convicted to 1 year and 6 months imprisonment. However, the court decided to exempt the perpetrator from serving the sentence by applying Amnesty Act. With this Amnesty Act, impunity was ensured, and here the victim challenges that Armenian authorities failed to discharge their obligations in order first to protect her against violence, and then to conduct an effective investigation and ensure punishment for the perpetrator. Mostly, the European Court of Human Rights considers those cases under Article 3, which prescribes prohibition of torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, and Article 8, which relates to private life, and all domestic related cases come within the ambit of this article. So this case is now communicated, and this case reveals systemic problems that Armenia faces, and those problems are mostly related to implementation, application of existing standards rather than gaps in legislation. And we are very positive about these strategic cases because they accelerate, speed up the reforms, and those judgments are being supervised by international bodies such as Committee of Ministers, and they might require general measures directed not only to the applicants, but also other people in the similar situation. And non-governmental organizations, they have possibilities to submit submissions to the Committee of Ministers and ask for specific general measures to be adopted with respect to Armenia. I will stop here, and I'm happy to address any other issues as needed.
Thank you so much, Professor Sahakyan. This was an excellent overview of, you touched on so many issues, and, and gave a very good perspective of, where, Armenia stands in terms of its, protection of women in all realms. And so we are really looking forward to your moderation of the next live program, which will be in October, concerning the future and global activism. And again, I just want to reiterate how much we appreciate doing these series of lectures with the AUA's Human Rights and Social Justice and Gender Studies minor programs, because it's critically important for us to work together and on this vitally important topic. So I want to thank you for your time today, and we will announce the date of the October program shortly. So thank you again.
Thank you.